Hello everybody, it is Thursday. That means that I am back with another lesson from ZooMontana. This week it's going to be on why zoos matter. For those of you who have not met me before, I am educator Emily and I am super stoked to lead you through this week's video. So we're going to be talking about, obviously, why zoos matter. But to answer that question, we're going to start talking about the history of zoos and the history of the science of zoology. We're going to be talking about the evolution from these old zoos into new modern zoos, how they differ drastically, why that difference is important. We're going to be talking about the science of zookeeping. We're going to be talking about why zoos are important for conservation and wildlife and science and everything like that and more. So sit tight, stick around, and get ready to learn all about why zoos matter. Alright, let's start off with some history. Humans think animals are super cool and we want to be around them all the time. That's why we have pets. And that's also why we've been keeping animals in human-made enclosures for up to 4,000 years. So the practice of keeping animals in a zoological-like setting is not a new concept. When people kept animals in these human-made enclosures, they weren't zoos like we know of zoos today. These were private establishments, mostly at-home collections that the wealthy had. So think, kings and emperors and sultans and princes and princesses from Europe and China and other parts of Asia and even in northern Africa. They had their own private menagerie of these exotic animals, and this was the very beginning of the practice of keeping exotic wild animals in human-made settings. Now, how did these animals get to these private rich menageries? Back then, zoos weren't already established, so it's not like you could have a zoo animal give birth in one zoo and transport that zoo animal to another zoo. So let's say that you're a Roman emperor, which is a pretty sweet gig, alright, and you're a Roman emperor and you're looking to expand or even start maybe your menagerie. So what you are going to do is you're going to employ a bunch of people to go to the native range of that animal, acquire that animal for you, and bring it back to Rome. So people would be taking these animals from their natural environment. So they'd be going out, sending a team of people out to capture that animal and bring it back to that human-made enclosure in Rome, Egypt, and Asia. Now, people didn't really know a lot about animals at that time, and people really didn't even know how to take care of themselves at that time. Hygiene and overall human care was pretty gross. So animal care was also extremely subpar, not up to what it needed. Sanitation was very poor, animal welfare was very poor. These animals in these private collections were often kept in very small enclosures, or they were chained out in the open. The animal couldn't move around in these enclosures, and as I'm sure you can probably guess, that when an animal can't move around and exercise or even stretch its legs, it's not going to be the best animal mentally. In addition to not having enough space to move around or comfortable conditions, sanitation in these private menageries was also very subpar, so things didn't get cleaned regularly and the animals also had very poor nutrition. And this is how animals were kept, unfortunately, for a very long time, up until around the 1700s when the Enlightenment started happening. Now, the Enlightenment was basically this cultural shift in how people thought about the world. It was basically an intellectual and philosophical revolution that emphasized the sciences and scholarly thinking. And this is when we started to see zoos kind of shift from these private menageries to more of a public or even a research institution. People were starting to explore more of the globe, they were starting to explore more of the natural habitats, and they were starting to think more about how these natural habitats and the animals that lived in them functioned and worked. So sciences like biology and evolution really started to grow, and the science of zoology was actually born during the Enlightenment from scientists who wanted to dedicate their time and their lives to specifically studying animals. So zoology is just the science of animals. And so when the scientists wanted to study behavior and anatomy and biology, it was often very difficult and very expensive for these scientists to go out into the field where these animals naturally existed. Instead, these scientists were like, hey, we have all of these animals in human enclosures, why don't I study them there? And the modern zoo was kind of born out of this zoological science movement. So much like today's zoos, the zoos of the Enlightenment were there for public entertainment, public enrichment, public education, as well as scientific research. Now, 2 fun zoo facts for you. The oldest zoo in the world is Tiergarten Schönbrunn in Vienna. This zoo was started as an imperial menagerie, so kind of like these big private collections that the royal and that the wealthy owned. Now, the oldest modern zoo is in Paris, France, and French is by no means my forte, so please excuse my pronunciation of this if I butcher it, but the oldest modern zoo is the Ménagerie des Jardins des Plantes. Sorry if I butchered that. Now, while zoological science and zoos in general were taking a step in the right direction, taking these animals out of private hands and making them available to the public, animal care in these Enlightenment era zoos still, it was not great. Many animals continued to live in small enclosures. The smaller the enclosure meant the more animals that you could fit in a zoo. Animals also had very little enrichment. When you go to modern zoos today, including ZooMontana, you'll see things like balls or boxes or ropes or things like that in the zoo enclosures to keep the animals mentally stimulated. These Enlightenment era zoos didn't know about that yet, and thus they completely lacked really any form of enrichment. Many people still have this conception of zoos, despite modern zoos looking nothing like these Enlightenment era zoos. In fact, this misconception is so broad that when you Google zoo, the first images that pop up are going to be images that look like these Enlightenment era zoos. However, most zoos today are extremely different. They're extremely better than these Enlightenment era zoos. Animals have larger, more natural enclosures. They have enrichment. They have companions. Many zoos are focused on quality over quantity, so animals are going to have ecologically suitable enclosures. And modern zoos have a very heavy emphasis on animal welfare and animal nutrition, animal conservation, things that these Enlightenment era zoos lacked. And in fact, many of the animals that are in zoos today are fed better, have better medical care than even some of the people that take care of them. Now, it's very easy to bash these Enlightenment era zoos, and when you bash them, you're definitely doing it rightfully. Like, no animal should have to live in, a small, dirty enclosure with no enrichment and poor nutrition. Yes, that is very true. However, these Enlightenment era zoos expanded the public knowledge of what was out there in the natural world and really began to get the public interested in animals and science. And without these Enlightenment era zoos, and same thing with zoos today, without people being able to see animals from all over the world, there's going to be very little progress in zoological conservation, zoological science, because you need the public to care about what the scientists are doing. So while the Enlightenment era zoos might have been extremely poor for animal welfare and conditions and nutrition and things like that, we do have to keep in mind that these Enlightenment era zoos paved the way for modern conservation and modern zoological education. Now, as I've kind of hinted at earlier on in this video, today's zoos have extremely strict standards on animal care and animal welfare. Now, these strict standards are present in all zoos, but they are extremely present in zoos that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, much like ZooMontana. Oftentimes in these zoos, animals have round-the-clock veterinary care by highly trained veterinary professionals that went to school specifically to care for zoo animals. Animals in zoos today are cared for by highly trained professional zookeepers. These zookeepers know exactly what these animals need to be able to live as healthy of a life as possible. In fact, zookeepers have to go to a 4-year college and get a degree in zookeeping to be able to care for these animals. There's even colleges specifically dedicated to the science of zookeeping. So animals in modern day zoos are cared for by highly trained professionals. The people who care for them really know what they're doing, and they really love and care about the animals that they care for. In fact, some of the animals at ZooMontana get better medical and nutritional care than I do, and I have to take care of myself. So these animals that are in modern day zoos are taken care of very, very well. Zoos today also have a very high emphasis on ecologically relevant and natural enclosures. So when you go to zoos like ZooMontana, San Diego Zoo, Brookfield Zoo, you're going to see enclosures that heavily mimic the natural environment of the animals that are inside of them. For example, at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, Illinois, if any of my viewers have been there, they have an African wild dog enclosure. Now, African wild dogs are wide-ranging social carnivores that live all throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and these guys are extremely efficient predators. And as you can assume, in a zoo-like setting, they really don't get to exhibit their predatory behaviors as much as they would in the wild. However, Brookfield Zoo has come up with a super ingenious way to allow these dogs to display their natural predatory behaviors with a sort of like meat zip line. And it's literally that. It's a zip line that goes over their enclosure, and they'll dangle pieces of carcass from it, meat for these animals, and thus the animals are allowed to hunt the meat on this meat zip line as it goes over their enclosure and exhibit behaviors that they would exhibit in the wild. And doing things like that for African wild dogs and many other animals, that enrichment is very good for an animal's mental well-being. And lots of zoos are heavily focused on doing things that will not only keep their animal's mental well-being stable, but enrich it and make it better. Now, remember when we were talking about private menageries that these emperors and these sultans and these princes and princesses had, and how they would go and send people to get these animals from the wild and bring them to their menagerie? That is a very rare occurrence in today's modern zoos. Most of the animals that you see in zoos have come from other zoos or were born at that zoo. Taking animals from the wild is basically a completely eliminated practice. Many zoos today, like ZooMontana, are also heavily focused on education and conservation. Like I said earlier, you need these zoos to increase public awareness of these animals and what is happening in their natural environments. Many people are not going to be able to travel the world and see a tiger or a lion or an orangutan. They're going to have to rely on their local zoos to tell them about those animals and tell them about what's happening in their environments. Not only do today's zoos emphasize public education, but many zoos are also involved in conservation initiatives locally and throughout the world. These conservation initiatives not only focus on researching and studying animals from across the globe, but they also focus on bringing back endangered species through species survival programs. Species survival programs breed endangered animals to help support good genes in the population and eventually hope to create a successful and healthy wild population. Now, many animals have been brought back to the wild because of these species survival programs. Examples of successful species survival program initiatives include the California condor, the Channel Island fox, the black-footed ferret, the bald eagle, and the Galapagos tortoise. Now, this is not the only way that zoos are useful for helping to raise awareness about conservation. AZA-accredited zoos help to raise over $1 billion in a time span of 5 years for these conservation initiatives. This money goes to organizations and research dedicated to conserving wildlife and their habitats. And lastly, zoos are important because they educate the public on what is happening in the wild. As we've talked about, many misconceptions of zoos still exist, and educators like me are here to help clear that up. By educating you guys on topics ranging from biodiversity to behavior to conservation to human-wildlife conflict, we're increasing the public knowledge and the public scope of zoological science. By doing that, we are helping to raise awareness about conservation and these animals worldwide. By spreading the knowledge, we spread awareness and we spread support. People are going to only care about what they know about, and they're only going to protect what they care about. By educating people, zoos are raising awareness about the plights of species and their environments worldwide. And now, especially as the human population grows and continues to expand and advance into natural habitats, often with very dire consequences for the species that live there, education that zoos deliver is increasingly becoming more important to raise public awareness about what we are doing to our natural world. Without this public awareness, we wouldn't know what's happening and we would have no motivation to help save it. Education is key. It's estimated that 600 million people every year visit zoos, and it's possible that that's an underrepresentation of the real number. That's 600 million people to impact and to educate and to tell about the wonders of these species and their natural environments. That's 600 million people that we can get to care about conservation. That's amazing. Zoos are what allow that to happen. Zoos are what allow people to get excited and stoked about the natural environment. In fact, I attribute much of my love and care for animals and the natural world because of my visits to zoos when I was a little girl. Without those experiences, many kids might not realize their passion for the environment and their passion for animals. Without discovering that passion, we might not have as many conservationists, scientists, biologists, zoologists, and zookeepers that we have now working to care for and conserve these animals. Down in the little box below, I'll put links to AZA, I'll put links to ZooMontana, and I'll put links for the information that I got for this video, and so you guys can continue to learn more about zoos and why they matter. Once this is all over, I hope you guys have the chance to go and visit your local zoo and support the animals and the people who work there. If you have any questions, zookeepers and educators like me are very happy to talk to you and answer your questions. That's why we do what we do. We love to get people excited about what we care about. Ask questions. That's one of the best ways to learn things. We don't care if it's a potentially stupid question. We'd love to tell you and help clear up any misconceptions or misunderstandings that you might have. We love to talk to you. That's what we're here for. That's what our job is. So, next time you come to a zoo, come find one of us, say hi, and ask us all the questions that you've got. Thank you for tuning in. We will have another video up for you guys next Thursday. I'm Educator Emily with ZooMontana, and I shall see you later.